Chapter 4 of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 4. Ionitch, Part 1. When visitors to the provincial town S complained of the dreariness and monotony of life, the inhabitants of the town, as though defending themselves, declared that it was very nice in S. There was a library, a theatre, a club, that they had balls, and finally that there were clever, agreeable, and interesting families with whom one could make acquaintance. And they used to point to the family the Turkins as the most highly cultivated and talented. This family lived in their own house in the principal street near the governor's. Ivan Petrovitch Turkin, himself a stout, handsome, dark man with whiskers, used to get up amateur performances for benevolent objects, and used to take the part of an elderly general, and cough very amusingly. He knew a number of anecdotes, charades, proverbs, and was fond of being humorous and witty, and he always wore an expression from which it was impossible to tell whether he were joking or in earnest. His wife, Vera Iosifovna, a thin, nice-looking lady who wore a pince-nez, used to write novels and stories, and was very fond of reading them aloud to her visitors. The daughter, Katerina Ivanovna, a young girl, used to play on the piano. In short, every member of the family had a special talent. The Turkins welcomed visitors, and good-humouredly displayed their talents with genuine simplicity. Their stone house was roomy and cool in summer. Half of the windows looked into a shady old garden where nightingales used to sing in the spring. When there were visitors in the house, there was a clatter of knives in the kitchen and a smell of fried onions in the yard, and that was always a sure sign of a plentiful and savoury supper to follow. And as soon as Dmitri Ionitch Startsev was appointed the district doctor, and took up his abode at Jalyzh, 6 miles from S, he too was told that as a cultivated man it was essential for him to make the acquaintance of the Turkins. In the winter he was introduced to Ivan Petrovitch in the street. They talked about the weather, about the theatre, about the cholera. An invitation followed. On a holiday in the spring, it was Ascension Day, after seeing his patients, Startsev set off for town in search of a little recreation and to make some purchases. He walked in a leisurely way (he had not yet set up his carriage), humming all the time, "Before I'd drunk the tears from life's goblet." In town he dined, went for a walk in the gardens. Then Ivan Petrovitch's invitation came into his mind, as if it were of itself, and he decided to call on the Turkins and to see what sort of people they were. "How do you do, if you please?" said Ivan Petrovitch, meeting him on the steps. Delighted to see such an agreeable visitor. Come along, I will introduce you to my better half. I tell him, Verochka," he went on, as he presented the doctor to his wife, "I tell him that he has no right to sit at home in a hospital. He ought to devote his leisure to society, oughtn't he, darling?" "Sit here," said Vera Iosifovna, making her visitor sit down beside her. "You can dance attendance on me. My husband is jealous; he is an Othello. But we will try and behave so well that he will notice nothing." "Ha, you spoilt chicken!" Ivan Petrovitch muttered tenderly, and he kissed her on the forehead. "You have come just in the nick of time," he said, addressing the doctor again. "My better half has written a hugest novel, and she is going to read it aloud to day." "Petit Jean," said Vera Iosifovna to her husband, "dites que l'on nous donne du thé." Startsev was introduced to Katerina Ivanovna, a girl of 18, very much like her mother, thin and pretty. Her expression was still childish, and her figure was soft and slim, and her developed girlish bosom, healthy and beautiful, was suggestive of spring, real spring. Then they drank tea with jam, honey, and sweetmeats, and with very nice cakes which melted in the mouth. As the evening came on, other visitors gradually arrived, and Ivan Petrovitch fixed his laughing eyes on each of them and said, "How do you do, if you please?" Then they all sat down in the drawing-room with very serious faces, and Vera Iosifovna read her novel. It began like this: "The frost was intense." The windows were wide open. From the kitchen came the clatter of knives and the smell of fried onions. It was comfortable in the soft, deep armchair. The lights had such a friendly twinkle in the twilight of the drawing-room, and at the moment, on a summer evening, when sounds of voices and laughter floated in from the streets, and whiffs of lilac from the yard, it was difficult to grasp that the frost was intense, and that the setting sun was lighting with its chilly rays a solitary wayfarer on the snowy plain. Vera Iosifovna read how a beautiful young countess founded a school, a hospital, a library in her village, and fell in love with a wandering artist. She read of what never happens in real life, and yet it was pleasant to listen. It was comfortable, and such agreeable, serene thoughts kept coming into the mind, one had no desire to get up. "Not bad, some," Ivan Petrovitch said softly, and one of the visitors, hearing, with his thoughts far away, said hardly audibly, "Yes, truly." 1 hour passed, another. In the town gardens close by a band was playing and a chorus was singing. When Vera Iosifovna shut her manuscript book, the company was silent for 5 minutes, listening to Lutchina being sung by the chorus, and the song gave what was not in the novel and is in real life. "Do you publish your stories in magazines?" Startsev asked Vera Iosifovna. "No," she answered, "I never publish. I write it and put it away in my cupboard. Why publish?" she explained. "We have enough to live on." And for some reason every one sighed. "And now, kitten, you play something," Ivan Petrovitch said to his daughter. The lid of the piano was raised, and the music, lying ready, was opened. Katerina Ivanovna sat down and banged on the piano with both hands, and then banged again with all her might, and then again and again. Her shoulders and bosom shook. She obstinately banged on the same notes, and it sounded as if she would not leave off until she had hammered the keys into the piano. The drawing-room was filled with the din. Everything was resounding: the floor, the ceiling, the furniture. Katerina Ivanovna was playing a difficult passage, interesting simply on account of its difficulty, long and monotonous, and Startsev, listening, pictured stones dropping down a steep hill and going on dropping, and he wished they would leave off dropping. And at the same time Katerina Ivanovna, rosy from the violent exercise, strong and vigorous, with a lock of hair falling over her forehead, attracted him very much. After the winter spent at Jalij among patients and peasants, to sit in a drawing-room, to watch this young, elegant, and in all probability pure creature, and to listen to these noisy, tedious, but still cultured sounds, was so pleasant, so novel. "Well, kitten, you have played as never before," said Ivan Petrovitch, with tears in his eyes, when his daughter had finished and stood up. "Die, Denis, you won't write anything better." All flocked round her, congratulated her, expressed astonishment, declared that it was long since they had heard such music, and she listened in silence with a faint smile, and her whole figure was expressive of triumph. "Superb! Superb!" "Splendid!" said Startsev too, carried away by the general enthusiasm. "Where have you studied?" he asked Katerina Ivanovna. "At the Conservatoire?" "No, I am only preparing for the Conservatoire, and till now have been working with Madame Zavlovsky." "Have you finished at the high school here?" "Oh, no. Vera Iosifovna answered for her. "We have teachers for her at home. There might be bad influences at the high school or a boarding school, you know. While a young girl is growing up, she ought to be under no influence but her mother's." "All the same, I'm going to the Conservatoire," said Katerina Ivanovna. "No, Kitten loves her mamma. Kitten won't grieve papa and mamma." "No, I'm going, said Katerina Ivanovna, with playful caprice and stamping her foot. And at supper it was Ivan Petrovitch who displayed his talents. Laughing only with his eyes, he told anecdotes, made epigrams, asked ridiculous riddles, and answered them himself, talking the whole time in his extraordinary language, evolved in the course of prolonged practice in witticism, and evidently now become a habit. "Badsome, hugeous, thank you most dumbly," and so on. But that was not all. When the guests, replete and satisfied, trooped into the hall, looking for their coats and sticks, there bustled about them the footman, Pavlusha, or, as he was called in the family, Pava, a lad of 14, with shaven head and chubby cheeks. "Come, Pava, perform," Ivan Petrovitch said to him. Pava struck an attitude, flung up his arm, and said in a tragic tone, "Unhappy woman, die!" and every one roared with laughter. "It's entertaining," thought Startsev as he went out into the street. He went to a restaurant and drank some beer, then set off to walk home to Jailij. He walked all the way singing, "Thy voice to me so languid and caressing." On going to bed he felt not the slightest fatigue after the 6 miles' walk. On the contrary, he felt as though he could with pleasure have walked another 20. Not badsome, he thought, and laughed as he fell asleep. II Startsev kept meaning to go to the Turkins' again, but there was a great deal of work in the hospital, and he was unable to find free time. In this way more than a year passed in work and solitude, but one day a letter in a light blue envelope was brought to him from the town. Vera Iosifovna had been suffering for some time from migraine, but now, since Kitten frightened her every day by saying that she was going away to the Conservatoire, the attacks began to be more frequent. All the doctors of the town had been at the Turkins'. At last it was the district doctor's turn. Vera Iosifovna wrote him a touching letter in which she begged him to come and relieve her sufferings. Startsev went, and after that he began to be often, very often, at the Turkins'. He really did something for Vera Iosifovna, and she was already telling all her visitors that he was a wonderful and exceptional doctor. But it was not for the sake of her migraine that he visited the Turkins' now. It was a holiday. Katerina Ivanovna finished her long, wearisome exercises on the piano. Then they sat a long time in the dining-room, drinking tea, and Ivan Petrovitch told some amusing story. Then there was a ring, and he had to go into the hall to welcome a guest. Startsev took advantage of the momentary commotion and whispered to Katerina Ivanovna in great agitation: "For God's sake, I entreat you, don't torment me. Let us go into the garden." She shrugged her shoulders as though perplexed and not knowing what he wanted of her, but she got up and went. "You play the piano for 3 or 4 hours," he said, following her. "Then you sit with your mother, and there is no possibility of speaking to you. Give me a quarter of an hour at least, I beseech you." Autumn was approaching, and it was quiet and melancholy in the old garden. The dark leaves lay thick in the walls. It was already beginning to get dark early. "I haven't seen you for a whole week," Startsev went on, "and if you only knew what suffering it is! Let us sit down. Listen to me." They had a favourite place in the garden, a seat under an old spreading maple, and now they sat down on this seat. "What do you want?" said Katerina Ivanovna dryly, in a matter-of-fact tone. "I have not seen you for a whole week. I have not heard you for so long. I long passionately. I thirst for your voice. Speak." She fascinated him by her freshness, the naïve expression of her eyes and cheeks. Even in the way her dress hung on her he saw something extraordinarily charming, touching in its simplicity and naïve grace, and at the same time, in spite of this naïveté, she seemed to him intelligent and developed beyond her years. He could talk with her about literature, about art, about anything he liked, could complain to her of life, of people, though it sometimes happened, in the middle of a serious conversation, she would laugh inappropriately or run away into the house. Like almost all girls of her neighbourhood, she had read a great deal. As a rule, people read very little in S, and at the lending library they said if it were not for the girls and the young Jews they might as well shut up the library. This afforded Startsev infinite delight. He used to ask her eagerly every time what she had been reading the last few days, and listened enthralled while she told him. "What have you been reading this week since I saw you last?" he asked now. "Do please tell me." "I have been reading Pisemsky." "What exactly?" "1,000 Souls," answered Kitten. "And what a funny name Pisemsky had! Alexey Feofilaktich." "Where are you going?" cried Startsev in horror, as she suddenly got up and walked toward the house. "I must talk to you. I want to explain myself. Stay with me just 5 minutes, I supplicate you." She stopped, as though she wanted to say something, then awkwardly thrust a note into his hand, ran home and sat down to the piano again. "Be in the cemetery," Startsev read, "at 11 o'clock tonight, near the tomb of Demetti." "Well, that's not at all clever," he thought, coming to himself. "Why the cemetery? What for?" It was clear Kitten was playing a prank. Who would seriously dream of making an appointment at night in the cemetery, far out of the town, when it might have been arranged in the street or in the town gardens? And was it in keeping with him, a district doctor, an intelligent, staid man, to be sighing, receiving notes to hang about cemeteries, to do silly things that even schoolboys think ridiculous nowadays? What would this romance lead to? What would his colleagues say when they heard of it? Such were Startsev's reflections as he wandered round the tables at the club, and at 10:30 he suddenly set off for the cemetery. By now he had his own pair of horses and a coachman called Panteleimon in a velvet waistcoat. The moon was shining; it was still warm, warm as it is in autumn. Dogs were howling in the suburb near the slaughter-house. Startsev left his horses in one of the side streets at the end of the town and walked on foot to the cemetery. We all have our oddities, he thought. Kitten is odd too, and who knows? Perhaps she is not joking. Perhaps she will come. And he abandoned himself to this faint, vain hope, and it intoxicated him. He walked for half a mile through the fields. The cemetery showed as a dark streak in the distance, like a forest or a big garden. The wall of white stone came into sight, the gate. In the moonlight he could read on the gate, "The hour cometh." Startsev went in at the little gate, and before anything else he saw the white crosses and monuments on both sides of the broad avenue, and the black shadows of them and the poplars, and for a long way round it was all white and black, and the slumbering trees bowed their branches over the white stones. It seemed as though it were lighter here than in the fields. The maple leaves stood out sharply like paws on the yellow sand of the avenue and on the stones, and the inscriptions on the tombs could be clearly read. For the first moments Startsev was struck now by what he saw for the first time in his life, and what he would probably never see again: a world not like anything else, a world in which the moonlight was as soft and beautiful, as though slumbering here in its cradle, where there was no life, none whatever, but in every dark poplar, in every tomb, there was felt the presence of a mystery that promised a life peaceful, beautiful, eternal. The stones and faded flowers, together with the autumn scent of the leaves, all told of forgiveness, melancholy, and peace. All was silent around. The stars looked down from the sky in the profound stillness, and Startsev's footsteps sounded loud and out of place, and only when the church clock began striking, and he imagined himself dead, buried there forever, he felt as though some one were looking at him. And for a moment he thought that it was not peace and tranquillity, but stifled despair, the dumb dreariness of non-existence. Dmitri's tomb was in the form of a shrine with an angel at the top. The Italian opera had once visited S, and one of the singers had died. She had been buried here, and this monument put up to her. No one in the town remembered her, but the lamp at the entrance reflected the moonlight and looked as though it were burning. There was no one, and indeed who would come here at midnight? But Startsev waited, and as though the moonlight warmed his passion, he waited passionately, and in imagination pictured kisses and embraces. He sat near the monument for half an hour, then paced up and down the side avenues with his hat in his hand, waiting and thinking of the many women and girls buried in these tombs who had been beautiful and fascinating, who had loved, at night burned with passion, yielding themselves to caresses. How wickedly Mother Nature jested at man's expense after all! How humiliating it was to recognize it! Startsev thought this, and at the same time he wanted to cry out that he wanted love, that he was eager for it at all costs. To his eyes they were not slabs of marble, but fair white bodies in the moonlight. He saw shapes hiding bashfully in the shadows of the trees, felt their warmth, and the languor was oppressive. And as though a curtain were lowered, the moon went behind a cloud, and suddenly all was darkness. Startsev could scarcely find the gate. By now it was as dark as it is on an autumn night. Then he wandered about for an hour and a half, looking for the side street in which he had left his horses. "I am tired, I can scarcely stand on my legs," he said to Panteleimon, and settling himself with relief in his carriage, he thought, "Ach, I ought not to get fat." 3. The following evening he went to the Turkins to make an offer, but it turned out to be an inconvenient moment, as Katerina Ivanovna was in her own room having her hair done by a hairdresser. She was getting ready to go to a dance at the club. He had to sit a long time again in the dining-room drinking tea. Ivan Petrovitch, seeing that his visitor was bored and preoccupied, drew some notes out of his waistcoat pocket, read a funny letter from a German steward saying that all the ironmongery was ruined and the plasticity was peeling off the walls. "I expect they will give a decent dowry," thought Startsev, listening absent-mindedly. After a sleepless night he found himself in a state of stupefaction, as though he had been given something sweet and soporific to drink. There was fog in his soul, but joy and warmth, and at the same time a sort of cold, heavy fragment of his brain was reflecting, "Stop it before it is too late. Is she the match for you? She is spoilt, whimsical, sleeps till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while you are a deacon's son, a district doctor. What of it?" he thought. "I don't care. Besides, if you marry her," the fragment went on, "then her relations will make you give up the district work and live in the town. After all," he thought, "if it must be the town it must be. They will give a dowry. We can establish ourselves suitably." At last Ekaterina Ivanovna came in, dressed for the ball, with a low neck, looking fresh and pretty, and Startsev admired her so much and went into such ecstasies that he could say nothing, but simply stared at her and laughed. She began saying good-bye, and he had no reason for staying now, got up, saying that it was time for him to go home. His patients were waiting for him. "Well, there's no help for that," said Ivan Petrovitch. "Go, and you might take Kitten to the club on the way." It was spotting with rain, it was very dark, and they could only tell where the horses were by Panteleimon's husky cough. The hood of the carriage was put up. "I stand upright, you lie down right, he lies all right," said Ivan Petrovitch as he put his daughter into the carriage. They drove off. "I was at the cemetery yesterday," Startsev began. "How ungenerous and merciless it was on your part." "You went to the cemetery?" Yes, I went there and waited almost till 2 o'clock. I suffered." "Well, suffer, if you cannot understand a joke." Ekaterina Ivanovna, pleased at having so cleverly taken in a man who was in love with her, and at being the object of such intense love, burst out laughing, and suddenly uttered a shriek of terror, for at that very minute the horses turned sharply in at the gate of the club, and the carriage almost tilted over. Startsev put his arm round Ekaterina Ivanovna's waist. In her fright she nestled up to him, and he could not restrain himself, and passionately kissed her on the lips and on the chin, and hugged her more tightly. "That's enough," she said dryly. And a minute later she was not in the carriage, and a policeman near the lighted entrance of the club shouted in a detestable voice to Panteleimon: "What are you stopping for, you crow? Drive on!" Startsev drove home, but soon afterwards returned. Attired in another man's dress suit and a stiff white tie which kept sawing at his neck and trying to slip away from the collar, he was sitting at midnight in the club drawing-room, and was saying with enthusiasm to Ekaterina Ivanovna: "Ah, how little people know who have never loved! It seems to me that no one has ever yet written of love truly, and I doubt whether this tender, joyful, agonizing feeling can be described, and any one who has once experienced it will not attempt to put it into words. What is the use of preliminaries and introductions? What is the use of unnecessary fine words? My love is immeasurable. I beg, beseech you," Startsev brought out at last, "be my wife." "Dmitri Ionitch," said Ekaterina Ivanovna, with a very grave face, after a moment's thought. "Dmitri Ionitch, I am very grateful to you for the honour. I respect you, but..." She got up and continued standing. "But forgive me, I cannot be your wife. Let us talk seriously. Dmitri Ionitch, you know I love art beyond everything in life. I adore music. I love it frantically. I have dedicated my whole life to it. I want to be an artist. I want fame, success, freedom. And you want me to go on living in this town, to go on living this empty, useless life which has become insufferable to me. To become a wife? Oh, no, forgive me. One must strive towards a lofty, glorious goal, and married life would put me in bondage for ever, Dmitri Ionitch." She faintly smiled as she pronounced his name. She thought of Alexey Feofilaktitch. "Dmitri Ionitch, you are a good, clever, honourable man. You are better than any one." Tears came into her eyes. "I feel for you with my whole heart, but you will understand." And she turned away and went out of the drawing-room to prevent herself from crying. Startsev's heart left off throbbing uneasily. Going out of the club into the street, he first of all tore off the stiff tie and drew a deep breath. He was a little ashamed, and his vanity was wounded. He had not expected a refusal, and could not believe that all his dreams, his hopes and yearnings had led him up to such a stupid end, just as in some little play at an amateur performance. And he was sorry for his feeling, for that love of his, so sorry that he felt as though he could have burst into sobs or have violently belaboured Panteleimon's broad back with his umbrella. For 3 days he could not get on with anything. He could not eat nor sleep. But when the news reached him that Ekaterina Ivanovna had gone away to Moscow to enter the conservatoire, he grew calmer and lived as before. Afterwards, remembering sometimes how he had wandered about the cemetery, or how he had driven all over the town to get a dress suit, he stretched lazily and said, "What a lot of trouble, though." 4. 4 years had passed. Startsev already had a large practice in the town. Every morning he hurriedly saw his patients at Gyalizh, then he drove in to see his town patients. By now he drove, not with a pair, but with a team of 3 with bells on them, and he returned home late at night. He had grown broader and stouter, and was not very fond of walking, as he was somewhat asthmatic. And Panteleimon had grown stout too, and the broader he grew, the more mournfully he sighed and complained of his hard luck. He was sick of driving. Startsev used to visit various households and met many people, but did not become intimate with any one. The inhabitants irritated him by their conversation, their views of life, and even their appearance. Experience taught him, by degrees, that while he played cards or lunched with one of these people, the man was a peaceful, friendly, and even intelligent human being; that as soon as one talked of anything not eatable, for instance of politics or science, he would be completely at a loss, or would expound a philosophy so stupid and ill-natured that there was nothing else to do but wave one's hand in despair and go away. Even when Startsev tried to talk to liberal citizens, saying, for instance, that humanity, thank God, was progressing, and that one day it would be possible to dispense with passports and capital punishment, the liberal citizen would look at him askance and ask him mistrustfully, "Then anyone could murder anyone he chose in the open street." And when at tea or supper Startsev observed in company that one should work, that one ought not to live without working, every one took this as a reproach and began to get angry and argue aggressively. With all that, the inhabitants did nothing, absolutely nothing, and took no interest in anything, and it was quite impossible to think of anything to say. And Startsev avoided conversation and confined himself to eating and playing vint, and when there was a family festival in some household and he was invited to a meal, then he sat and ate in silence, looking at his plate. And everything that was said at the time was uninteresting, unjust, and stupid. He felt irritated and disturbed, but held his tongue, and because he sat glumly silent and looked at his plate, he was nicknamed in the town the haughty Pole, though he had never been a Pole. All such entertainments as theatres and concerts he declined, but he played vint every evening for 3 hours with enjoyment. He had another diversion to which he took imperceptibly. Little by little, in the evening he would take out of his pockets the notes he had gained by his practice, and sometimes there were stuffed in his pockets notes yellow and green, and smelling of scent and vinegar and incense and fish oil, up to the value of 70 roubles, and when they amounted to some hundreds, he took them to the Mutual Credit Bank and deposited the money there to his account. He was only twice at the Turkins' in the course of the 4 years after Katerina Ivanovna had gone away, on each occasion at the invitation of Vera Iosifovna, who was still undergoing treatment for migraine. Every summer Katerina Ivanovna came to stay with her parents, but he did not once see her. It somehow never happened. But now 4 years had passed. One still warm morning a letter was brought to the hospital. Vera Iosifovna wrote to Dmitri Ionitch that she was missing him very much, and begged him to come and see them, and to relieve her sufferings, and, by the way, it was her birthday. Below was a postscript: "I join in my mother's request. K." Startsev considered, and in the evening he went to the Turkins'. "How do you do, if you please?" Ivan Petrovitch met him, smiling with his eyes only. "Bonjour." Vera Iosifovna, white-haired and looking much older, shook Startsev's hand, sighed affectionately, and said: "You don't care to pay attentions to me, doctor. You never come and see us. I am too old for you. But now some one young has come, perhaps she will be more fortunate." And Kitten? She had grown thinner, paler, had grown handsomer and more graceful. But now she was Ekaterina Ivanovna, not Kitten. She had lost the freshness and look of childish naïveté, and in her expression and manners there was something new, guilty and diffident, as though she did not feel herself at home here in the Turkins' house. "How many summers, how many winters!" she said, giving Startsev her hand, and he could see that her heart was beating with excitement. And looking at him intently and curiously, she went on: "How much stouter you are! You look sunburnt and more manly, but on the whole you have changed very little." Now, too, he thought her attractive, very attractive, but there was something lacking in her. or else something superfluous. He could not himself have said exactly what it was, but something prevented him from feeling as before. He did not like her pallor, her new expression, her faint smile, her voice, and soon afterwards he disliked her clothes too, the low chair in which she was sitting. He disliked something in the past when he had almost married her. He thought of his love, of the dreams and the hopes which had troubled him 4 years before, and he felt awkward. They had tea with cakes. Then Vera Iosifovna read aloud a novel. She read of things that never happen in real life, and Startsev listened, looked at her handsome grey head, and waited for her to finish. People are not stupid because they can't write novels, but because they can't conceal it when they do, he thought. Not bad, said Ivan Petrovitch. Then Katerina Ivanovna played long and noisily on the piano, and when she finished she was profusely thanked and warmly praised. It's a good thing I did not marry her, thought Startsev. She looked at him and evidently expected him to ask her to go into the garden, but he remained silent. "Let's have a talk," she said, going up to him. "How are you getting on? What are you doing? How are things? I have been thinking about you all these days," she went on nervously. "I wanted to write to you. I wanted to come myself to see you at Jalizh. I quite made up my mind to go, but afterwards I thought better of it. God knows what your attitude is towards me now. I have been looking forward to seeing you to day with such emotion. For goodness' sake, let us go into the garden." They went into the garden and sat down on the seat under the old maple, just as they had done 4 years before. It was dark. "How are you getting on?" asked Katerina Ivanovna. "Oh, all right. I'm jogging along," answered Startsev. And he could think of nothing more. They were silent. "I feel so excited," said Katerina Ivanovna, and she hid her face in her hands. "But don't pay attention to it. I am so happy to be at home. I am so glad to see every one. I can't get used to it. So many memories. I thought we should talk without stopping till morning." Now he saw her face near, her shining eyes, and in the darkness she looked younger than in the room, and even her old childish expression seemed to have come back to her. And indeed she was looking at him with naïve curiosity, as though she wanted to get a closer view and understanding of the man who had loved her so ardently, with such tenderness, and so unsuccessfully. Her eyes thanked him for that love, and he remembered all that had been, every minute detail, how he had wandered about the cemetery, how he had returned home in the morning, exhausted, and he suddenly felt sad and regretted the past. A warmth began glowing in his heart. "Do you remember how I took you to the dance at the club?" he asked. "It was dark and rainy then." The warmth was glowing now in his heart, and he longed to talk, to rail at life. "Ech!" he said with a sigh. "You ask how I am living. How do we live here? Why, not at all. We grow old, we grow stout, we go slack. Day after day passes, life slips by without colour, without expression, without thoughts. In the daytime working for gain, and in the evening the club, the company of card players, alcoholic, raucous-voiced gentlemen whom I can't endure. What is there nice in it?" "Well, you have work, a noble object in life. You used to be so fond of talking of your hospital. I was such a queer girl then. I imagined myself such a great pianist. Nowadays all young ladies play the piano, and I played too, like everybody else, and there was nothing special about me. I am just such a pianist as my mother is an authoress. And of course I didn't understand you then, but afterwards in Moscow I often thought of you. I thought of no one but you. What happiness to be a district doctor, to help the suffering, to be serving the people! What happiness!" Katerina Ivanovna repeated with enthusiasm. "When I thought of you in Moscow, you seemed to me so ideal, so lofty." Startsev thought of the notes he used to take out of his pockets in the evening with such pleasure, and the glow in his heart was quenched. He got up to go into the house. She took his arm. "You are the best man I've known in my life," she went on. "We will see each other and talk, won't we? Promise me. I am not a pianist. I am not in error about myself now, and I will not play before you or talk of music." When they had gone into the house, and when Startsev saw in the lamplight her face, and her sad, grateful, searching eyes fixed upon him, he felt uneasy and thought again, "It's a good thing I did not marry her then." He began taking leave. "You have no human right to go before supper," said Ivan Petrovitch as he saw him off. "It's extremely perpendicular on your part. Well, now, perform," he added, addressing Pava in the hall. Pava, no longer a boy, but a young man with moustaches, threw himself into an attitude, flung up his arm, and said in a tragic voice, "Unhappy woman, die!" All this irritated Startsev. Getting into his carriage and looking at the dark house and garden which had once been so precious and so dear, he thought of everything at once: Vera Iosifovna's novels, and Kitten's noisy playing, and Ivan Petrovitch's jokes, and Pava's tragic posturing, and thought, if the most talented people in the town were so futile, what must the town be? 3 days later Pava brought a letter from Katerina Ivanovna. "You don't come and see us. Why?" she wrote to him. "I am afraid that you have changed toward us. I am afraid, and I am terrified at the very thought of it. Reassure me, come and tell me that everything is well. I must talk to you. Your E.I." He read this letter, thought a moment, and said to Pava, "Tell them, my good fellow, that I can't come to day. I am very busy. Say I will come in 3 days or so." But 3 days passed, a week passed; he still did not go. Happening once to drive past the Turkins' house, he thought he must go in, if only for a moment, but on second thoughts did not go in. And he never went to the Turkins again. 5. Several more years have passed. Startsev has grown stouter still, has grown corpulent, breathes heavily, and already walks with his head thrown back. When stout and red in the face, he drives with his bells and his team of 3 horses, and Panteleimon, also stout and red in the face, with his thick beefy neck, sits on the box, holding his arms stiffly out before him as though they were made of wood, and shouts to those he meets, "Keep to the right!" It is an impressive picture. One might think it was not a mortal, but some heathen deity in his chariot. He has an immense practice in the town, no time to breathe, and already has an estate and 2 houses in the town, and he is looking out for a third more profitable. And when at the Mutual Credit Bank he is told of a house that is for sale, he goes to the house without ceremony, and marching through all the rooms, regardless of the half-dressed women and children who gaze at him in amazement and alarm, he prods at the doors with his stick and says, "Is that the study? Is that a bedroom? And what's here?" And as he does, he breathes heavily and wipes the sweat from his brow. He has a great deal to do, but still he does not give up his work as district doctor. He is greedy for gain, and he tries to be in all places at once. At Jalyizh and in the town he is simply called Ionitch. "Where is Ionitch off to?" Or, "Should we not call in Ionitch to a consultation?" Perhaps because his throat is covered with rolls of fat, his voice has changed. It has become thin and sharp. His temper has changed too. He has grown ill-humoured and irritable. When he sees his patients, he is usually out of temper. He impatiently taps the floor with his stick and shouts in his disagreeable voice, "Be good as to confine yourself to answering my questions. Don't talk so much." He is solitary. He leads a dreary life. Nothing interests him. During all the years he had lived at Jalyizh, his love for Kitten had been his one joy, and probably his last. In the evenings he plays vint at the club, and then sits alone at a big table and has supper. Ivan, the oldest and most respectable of the waiters, serves him, hands him Lafitte No. 17, and every one at the club, the members of the committee, the cook and waiters, know what he likes and what he doesn't like, and do their very utmost to satisfy him, or else he is sure to fly into a rage and bang on the floor with his stick. As he eats his supper he turns round from time to time and puts in his spoke in some conversation. "What are you talking about, eh? Whom?" And when at a neighbouring table there is talk of the Turkins, he asks, "What Turkins are you speaking of? Do you mean the people whose daughter plays on the piano?" That is all that can be said about him. And the Turkins? Ivan Petrovitch has grown no older. He is not changed in the least, and still makes jokes and tells anecdotes as of old. Vera Iosifovna still reads her novels aloud to her visitors with eagerness and touching simplicity, and Kitten plays the piano for 4 hours every day. She has grown visibly older, is constantly ailing, and every autumn goes to the Crimea with her mother. When Ivan Petrovitch sees them off at the station, he wipes his tears as the train starts and shouts, "Good-bye, if you please," and he waves his handkerchief. End of chapter 4. Of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 5. The Head of the Family. It is, as a rule, after losing heavily at cards or after a drinking bout, when an attack of dyspepsia is setting in, that Stepan Stepanitch Zhilin wakes up in an exceptionally gloomy frame of mind. He looks sour, rumpled, and dishevelled. There is an expression of displeasure on his grey face, as though he were offended or disgusted by something. He dresses slowly, sips his Vichy water deliberately, and begins walking about the rooms. "I should like to know what beast comes in here and does not shut the door," he grumbles angrily, wrapping his dressing-gown about him and spitting loudly. "Take away that paper. Why is it lying about here? We keep 20 servants, and the place is more untidy than a pothouse. Who was that ringing? Who the devil is that?" "That's Anfissa, the midwife, who brought our Fedya into the world," answers his wife. "Always hanging about, those cadging toadies." "There's no making you out, Stepan Stepanitch. You asked her yourself, and now you scold." "I'm not scolding, I am speaking. You might find something to do, my dear, instead of sitting with your hands in your lap, trying to pick a quarrel. Upon my word, women are beyond my comprehension. Beyond my comprehension. How can they waste whole days doing nothing? A man works like an ox, like a beast, while his wife, the partner of his life, sits like a pretty doll, sits and does nothing but watch for an opportunity to quarrel with her husband by way of diversion. It's time to drop these schoolgirlish ways, my dear. You are not a schoolgirl, not a young lady. You are a wife and a mother. You turn away? It's not agreeable to listen to the bitter truth." "It's strange that you only speak the bitter truth when your liver is out of order." "That's right. Get up a scene." "Have you been out late, or playing cards?" "What if I have? Is that anybody's business? Am I obliged to give an account of my doings to any one? It's my own money I lose, I suppose. What I spend, as well as what is spent in this house, belongs to me. Me! Do you hear? To me!" And so on, all in the same style, But at no other time is Stepan Stepanitch so reasonable, virtuous, stern, or just as at dinner, when all his household are sitting about him. It usually begins with the soup. After swallowing the first spoonful, Zhilin suddenly frowns and puts down his spoon. "Damn it all!" he mutters. "I shall have to dine at a restaurant, I suppose." "What's wrong?" asked his wife anxiously. "Isn't the soup good?" "One must have the taste of a pig to eat hogwash like that. There's too much salt in it. It smells of dirty rags, more like bugs than onions. It's simply revolting, Anfisa Ivanovna," he says, addressing the midwife. "Every day I give no end of money for housekeeping. I deny myself everything, and this is what they provide for my dinner. I suppose they want me to give up the office and go into the kitchen to do some cooking myself." "The soup is very good to-day," the governess ventures timidly. "Oh, you think so?" says Zhilin, looking at her angrily from under his eyelids. "Every one to his taste, of course. It must be confessed our tastes are very different, Varvara Vassilievna. You, for instance, are satisfied with the behaviour of this boy." Zhilin, with a tragic gesture, points to his son Fedya. "You are delighted with him, while I am disgusted, yes." Fedya, a boy of 7, with a pale, sickly face, leaves off eating and drops his eyes. His face grows paler still. "Yes, you are delighted, and I am disgusted. Which of us is right, I cannot say, but I venture to think, as his father, I know my own son better than you do. Look how he is sitting. Is that the way decently brought-up children sit? Sit properly." Fedya tilts his chin up, cranes his neck, and fancies that he is holding himself better. Tears come into his eyes. "Eat your dinner. Hold your spoon properly. You wait. I'll show you, you horrid boy. Don't dare to whimper. Look straight at me." Fedya tries to look straight at him, but his face is quivering and his eyes filled with tears. "Ah, you cry. You're naughty, and then you cry. Go stand in the corner, you beast." "But let him have his dinner first," his wife intervenes. "No dinner for him. Such rascals don't deserve dinner." Fedya, wincing and quivering all over, creeps down from his chair and goes into the corner. "You won't get off with that," his parent persists. "If nobody else cares to look after your bringing up, so be it. I must begin. I won't let you be naughty and cry at dinner, my lad. Idiot! You must do your duty. Do you understand? Do your duty. Your father works, and you must work too. No one must eat the bread of idleness. You must be a man, a man." "For God's sake, leave off," says his wife in French. "Don't nag at us before outsiders, at least. The old woman is all ears, and now, thanks to her, all the town will hear of it." "I am not afraid of outsiders," answers Zhilin in Russian. "Anfisa Ivanovna sees that I am speaking the truth. Why do you think I ought to be pleased with the boy? Do you know what he costs me? Do you know what he costs me? Do you know, you nasty boy, what you cost me? Or do you imagine that I coin money, that I get it for nothing? Don't howl. Hold your tongue. Do you hear what I say? Do you want me to whip you, you young ruffian?" Fedya wails aloud and begins to sob. "This is insufferable," said his mother, getting up from the table and flinging down her dinner napkin. "You never let us have dinner in peace. Your bread sticks in my throat." And putting her handkerchief to her eyes, she walks out of the dining-room. "Now she is offended," grumbles Zhilin with a forced smile. "She's been spoilt. That's how it is, Anfisa Ivanovna. No one likes to hear the truth nowadays. It's all my fault, it seems." Several minutes of silence follow. Zhilin looks around at the plates, and noticing that no one has yet touched their soup, heaves a deep sigh and stares at the flushed and uneasy face of the governess. "Why don't you eat, Varvara Vassilievna?" he asked. "Offended, I suppose. I see. You don't like to be told the truth. You must forgive me. It's my nature. I can't be a hypocrite. I always blurt out the plain truth. But I notice that my presence is unwelcome. No one can eat or talk while I am here. Well, you should have told me, and I would have gone away. I will go." Жилин gets up and walks with dignity to the door. As he passes the weeping Fedya, he stops. "After all that has passed here, you are free," he says to Fedya, throwing back his head with dignity. "I won't meddle in your bringing up again. I wash my hands of it. I humbly apologize that as a father, from a sincere desire for your welfare, I have disturbed you and your mentors. At the same time, once for all, I disclaim all responsibility for your future." Fedya wails and sobs more loudly than ever. Жилин turns with dignity to the door and departs to his bedroom. When he wakes from his after-dinner nap, he begins to feel the stings of conscience. He is ashamed to face his wife, his son, and Anfisa Ivanovna, and even feels very wretched when he recalls the scene at dinner. But his amour propre is too much for him. He has not the manliness to be frank, and he goes on sulking and grumbling. Waking up next morning, he feels in excellent spirits and whistles gaily as he washes. Going into the dining-room to breakfast, he finds there Fedya, who at the sight of his father gets up and looks at him helplessly. "Well, young man," Жилин greets him good-humouredly, sitting down to the table. "What have you got to tell me, young man? Are you all right? Well, come, chubby, give your father a kiss." With a pale, grave face, Fedya goes up to his father and touches his cheek with his quivering lips, then walks away and sits down in his place without a word. End of chapter 5. Of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 6. Volodya. At 5 o'clock one Sunday afternoon in summer, Volodya, a plain, shy, sickly-looking lad of 17, was sitting in the arbour of the Shumihins' country villa, feeling dreary. His despondent thought flowed in 3 directions. In the first place, he had next day, Monday, an examination in mathematics. He knew that if he did not get through the written examination on the morrow, he would be expelled, for he had already been 2 years in the 6th form and had 2 3/4 marks for algebra in his annual report. In the second place, his presence at the villa of the Shumihins, a wealthy family with aristocratic pretensions, was a continual source of mortification to his amour propre. It seemed to him that Madame Shumihin looked upon him and his maman as poor relations and dependents, that they laughed at his maman and did not respect her. He had on one occasion accidentally overheard Madame Shumihin on the veranda telling her cousin Anna Fyodorovna that his maman still tried to look young and got herself up, that she never paid her losses at cards, and had a partiality for other people's shoes and tobacco. Every day Volodya besought his maman not to go to the Shumihins, and drew a picture of the humiliating part she played with these gentle folk. He tried to persuade her, said rude things, but she, a frivolous, pampered woman who had run through 2 fortunes, her own and her husband's, in her time, and always gravitated toward acquaintances of high rank, did not understand him, and twice a week Volodya had to accompany her to the villa he hated. In the third place, the youth could not for one instant get rid of a strange, unpleasant feeling which was absolutely new to him. It seemed to him that he was in love with Anna Fyodorovna, the Shumihin's cousin who was staying with them. She was a vivacious, loud-voiced, laughter-loving, healthy and vigorous lady of 30, with rosy cheeks, plump shoulders, a plump round chin, and a continual smile on her thin lips. She was neither young nor beautiful. Volodya knew that perfectly well, but for some reason he could not help thinking of her, looking at her while she shrugged her plump shoulders and moved her flat back as she played croquet, or after prolonged laughter and running up and down stairs sank into a low chair, and half closing her eyes and gasping for breath, pretended that she was stifling and could not breathe. She was married. Her husband, a staid and dignified architect, came once a week to the villa, slept soundly, and returned to town. Volodya's strange feeling had begun with his conceiving an unaccountable hatred for the architect, and feeling relieved every time he went back to town. Now, sitting in the arbour, thinking of his examination next day and of his maman, at whom they laughed, he felt an intense desire to see Nyuta (that was what the Shumihins called Anna Fyodorovna), to hear her laughter and the rustle of her dress. This desire was not like the pure poetic love of which he read in novels, and about which he dreamed every night when he went to bed. It was strange, incomprehensible. He was ashamed of it and afraid of it, as of something very wrong and impure, something which it was disagreeable to confess even to himself. "It's not love," he said to himself. "One can't fall in love with women of 30 who are married. It's only a little intrigue, yes, an intrigue." Pondering on the intrigue, he thought of his uncontrollable shyness, his lack of moustache, his freckles, his narrow eyes, and put himself, in his imagination, side by side with Nyuta, and the juxtaposition seemed to him impossible. Then he made haste to imagine himself bold, handsome, witty, dressed in the latest fashion. When his dreams were at their height, as he sat huddled together and looking at the ground in a dark corner of the arbour, he heard the sounds of light footsteps. Some one was coming slowly along the avenue. Soon the steps stopped and something white gleamed in the entrance. "Is there any one here?" asked a woman's voice. Volodya recognised the voice and raised his head in affright. "Who is here?" asked Nyuta, going into the arbour. "Ah, it is you, Volodya! What are you doing here? Thinking? And how can you go on thinking? That's the way to go out of your mind." Volodya got up and looked in a dazed way at Nyuta. She had only just come back from bathing. Over her shoulder there was hanging a sheet and a rough towel, and from under the white silk kerchief on her head he could see the wet hair sticking to her forehead. There was the cool, damp smell of the bath-house and of almond soap still hanging about her. She was out of breath from running quickly. The top button of her blouse was undone, so that the boy saw her throat and bosom. Why don't you say something?" said Nyuta, looking Volodya up and down. "It's not polite to be silent when a lady talks to you. What a clumsy seal you are, though, Volodya! You always sit saying nothing, thinking like some philosopher. There's not a spark of life or fire in you. You are really horrid. At your age you ought to be living, skipping and jumping, chattering, flirting, falling in love." Volodya looked at the sheet that was held by a plump white hand and thought. "He's mute," said Nyuta with wonder. "It is strange, really. Listen, be a man. Come, you might smile at least. Phew! The horrid philosopher!" She laughed. "But do you know, Volodya, why you are such a clumsy seal? Because you don't devote yourself to the ladies. Why don't you? It's true, there are no girls here, but there's nothing to prevent your flirting with the married ladies. Why don't you flirt with me, for instance?" Volodya listened and scratched his forehead in acute and painful irresolution. "It's only very proud people who are silent and love solitude," Nyuta went on, pulling his hand away from his forehead. "You are proud, Volodya. Why do you look at me like that from under your brows? Look me straight in the face, if you please. Yes, now then, clumsy seal." Volodya made up his mind to speak. Wanting to smile, he twitched his lower lip, blinked, and again put his hand to his forehead. "I love you," he said. Nyuta raised her eyebrows in surprise and laughed. "What do I hear?" she sang, as prima donnas sing at the opera when they hear something awful. "What? What did you say? Say it again, say it again." "I love you," repeated Volodya. And without his will's having any part in his action, without reflection or understanding, he took half a step toward Nyuta and clutched her by the arm. Everything was dark before his eyes, and tears came into them. The whole world was turned into one big rough towel, which smelt of the bath-house. "Bravo! Bravo!" he heard a merry laugh. "Why don't you speak? I want you to speak. Well?" Seeing that he was not prevented from holding her arm, Volodya glanced at Nyuta's laughing face, and clumsily, awkwardly, put both arms around her waist, his hands meeting behind her back. He held her round the waist with both arms, while putting her hands up over her head, showing the dimples in her elbows, she set her hair straight under the kerchief and said in a calm voice: "You must be tactful, polite, charming, and you can only become that under feminine influence. But what a wicked, angry face you have! You must talk, laugh. Yes, Volodya, don't be surly. You are young and will have plenty of time for philosophizing. Come, let go of me. I am going. Let's go." Without effort she released her waist, and humming something walked out of the arbour. Volodya was left alone. He smoothed his hair, smiled, and walked 3 times to and fro across the arbour. Then he sat down on the bench and smiled again. He felt insufferably ashamed, so much so that he wondered that human shame could reach such a pitch of acuteness and intensity. Shame made him smile, gesticulate, and whisper some disconnected words. He was ashamed that he had been treated like a small boy, ashamed of his shyness, and most of all that he had had the audacity to put his arms round the waist of a respectable married woman, though, as it seemed to him, he had neither through age, nor by external quality, nor by social position, any right to do so. He jumped up, went out of the arbour, and without looking round walked into the recesses of the garden furthest from the house. "Ah, only to get away from here as soon as possible," he thought, clutching his hand. "My God, as soon as possible!" The train by which Volodya was to go back with his maman was at 8:40. There were 3 hours before the train started, but he would with pleasure have gone to the station at once, without waiting for his maman. At 8 o'clock he went to the house. His whole figure was expressive of determination. What would be, would be. He made up his mind to go in boldly, to look them straight in the face, to speak in a loud voice, regardless of everything. He crossed the terrace, the big hall, and the drawing-room, and there stopped to take breath. He could hear them in the dining-room, drinking tea. Madame Shumihin, maman, and Nyuta were talking and laughing about something. Volodya listened. "I assure you," said Nyuta, "I could not believe my eyes when he began declaring his passion, and just imagine, put his arms round my waist, I should not have recognised him. And you know, he has a way with him. When he told me he was in love with me, there was something brutal in his face, like a Circassian." "Really?" gasped maman, going off into a peal of laughter. "Really? How he does remind me of his father!" Volodya ran back and dashed out into the open air. How could they talk of it aloud? He wondered in agony, clasping his hands and looking up to the sky in horror. They talked aloud in cold blood, and maman laughed. Maman! My God, why didst thou give me such a mother? Why? But he had to go to the house, come what might. He walked 3 times up and down the avenue, grew a little calmer, and went into the house. "Why didn't you come in time for tea?" Madame Shumihin asked sternly. "I'm sorry, it's time for me to go," he muttered, not raising his eyes. "Maman, it's 8 o'clock." "You go alone, my dear," said his maman languidly. "I am staying the night with Lili. Good bye, my dear. Let me make the sign of the cross over you." She made the sign of the cross over her son, and said in French, turning to Nyuta: "He's rather like Lermontov, isn't he?" Saying good-bye after a fashion, without looking any one in the face, Volodya went out of the dining-room. 10 minutes later he was walking along the road to the station, and was glad of it. Now he felt neither frightened nor ashamed. He breathed freely and easily. About half a mile from the station he sat down on a stone by the side of the road and gazed at the sun, which was half hidden behind a barrow. There were lights already here and there at the station, and one green light glimmered dimly, but the train was not yet in sight. It was pleasant to Volodya to sit still without moving, and to watch the evening coming little by little. The darkness of the arbour, the footsteps, the smell of the bath-house, the laughter, and the waste, all those rose with amazing vividness before his imagination, and all this was no longer so terrible and important as before. "It is of no consequence. She did not pull her hand away, and laughed when I held her by the waist," he thought. "So she must have liked it. If she had disliked it, she would have been angry." And now Volodya felt sorry that he had not had more boldness there in the arbour. He felt sorry that he was so stupidly going away, and he was by now persuaded that if the same thing happened again, he would be bolder and look at it more simply. And it would not be difficult for the opportunity to occur again. They used to stroll about for a long time after supper at the Shumihins'. If Volodya went for a walk with Nyuta in the dark garden, there would be an opportunity. "I will go back," he thought, "and will go by the morning train to morrow. I will say I have missed the train." And he turned back. Madame Shumihin, maman, Nyuta, and one of the nieces were sitting on the veranda playing vint. When Volodya told them the lie that he had missed the train, they were uneasy that he might be late for the examination day, and advised him to get up early. All the while they were playing he sat on one side, greedily watching Nyuta and waiting. He already had a plan prepared in his mind. He would go up to Nyuta in the dark, would take her by the hand, then would embrace her. There would be no need to say anything, as both of them would understand without words. But after supper the ladies did not go for a walk in the garden, but went on playing cards. They played till 1 o'clock at night, and then broke up to go to bed. "How stupid it all is!" Volodya thought with vexation as he got into bed. "But never mind, I'll wait till to-morrow. To-morrow in the arbour. Doesn't matter." He did not attempt to go to sleep, but sat in bed, hugging his knees and thinking. All thought of the examination was hateful to him. He had already made up his mind that they would expel him, and that there was nothing terrible about his being expelled. On the contrary, it was a good thing, a very good thing, in fact. Next day he would be as free as a bird. He would put on ordinary clothes instead of his school uniform, would smoke openly, come out here and make love to Nyuta when he liked. And he would not be a schoolboy, but a young man. And as for the rest of it, what is called a career, a future, that was clear. Volodya would go into the army, or the telegraph service, or he would go into a chemist's shop and work his way up until he was a dispenser. There were lots of callings. An hour or two passed, and he was still sitting and thinking. Towards 3 o'clock, when it was beginning to get light, the door creaked cautiously, and his maman came into the room. "Aren't you asleep?" she asked, yawning. "Go to sleep. I've only come in for a minute. I'm only fetching the drops." "What for?" "Poor Lily has got spasms again. Go to sleep, my child. Your examination's to-morrow." She took a bottle of something out of the cupboard, went to the window, read the label, and went away. "Marya Leontievna, those are not the drops," Volodya heard a woman's voice a minute later. "That's convallaria. Lily wants morphine. Is your son asleep? Ask him to look for it." It was Nyuta's voice. Volodya turned cold. He hurriedly put on his trousers, flung his coat over his shoulders, and went to the door. "Do you understand? Morphine," Nyuta explained in a whisper. "There must be a label in Latin. Wake Volodya; he will find it." Maman opened the door, and Volodya caught sight of Nyuta. She was wearing the same loose wrapper in which she had gone to bathe. Her hair hung loose and disordered on her shoulders. Her face looked sleepy and dark in the half light. "Why, Volodya is not asleep," she said. "Volodya, look in the cupboard for the morphine. There's a dear. What a nuisance Lily is! She's always something the matter." Mamma muttered something, yawned, and went away. "Look for it," said Nyuta. "Why are you standing still?" Volodya went to the cupboard, knelt down, and began looking through the bottles and boxes of medicine. His hands were trembling, and he had a feeling in his chest and stomach as though cold waves were running all over his inside. He felt suffocated and giddy from the smell of ether, carbolic acid, and various drugs, which he quite unnecessarily snatched up with his trembling fingers and spilled in so doing. "I believe maman has gone," he thought. "It's a good thing, a good thing." "Will you be quick?" said Nyuta, drawling. "In a minute. Here, I believe this is morphine," said Volodya, reading on one of the labels the word "Here it is." Nyuta was standing in the doorway in such a way that one foot was in his room and one was in the passage. She was tidying her hair, which was difficult to put in order because it was so thick and long, and looked absent-mindedly at Volodya. In her loose wrap, with her sleepy face and her hair down, in the dim light that came into the white sky, not yet lit by the sun, she seemed to Volodya captivating, magnificent, fascinated, trembling all over, and remembering with relish how he had held that exquisite body in his arms in the arbour. He handed her the bottle and said: "How wonderful you are!" "What?" She came into the room. "What?" she asked, smiling. He was silent and looked at her. Then, just as in the arbour, he took her hand, and she looked at him with a smile and waited for what would happen next. "I love you," he whispered. She left off smiling, thought a minute, and said: "Wait a little, I think some one is coming. All those schoolboys," she said in an undertone, going to the door and peeping out into the passage. "No, there is no one to be seen." She came back. Then it seemed to Volodya that the room, Nyuta, the sunrise, and himself all melted together in one sensation of acute, extraordinary, incredible bliss, for which one might give up one's whole life and face eternal torments. But half a minute passed, and all that vanished. Volodya saw only a fat, plain face, distorted by an expression of repulsion, and he himself suddenly felt a loathing for what had happened. "I must go away, though," said Nyuta, looking at Volodya with disgust. "What a wretched, ugly, ugly duckling! How unseemly her long hair, her loose wrap, her steps, her voice seemed to Volodya now. Ugly duckling, he thought after she had gone away. I really am ugly. Everything is ugly. The sun was rising. The birds were singing loudly. He could hear the gardener walking in the garden, and the creaking of his wheelbarrow. And soon afterwards he heard the lowing of the cows and the sounds of the shepherd's pipe. The sunlight and the sounds told him that somewhere in this world there is a pure, refined, poetical life. But where was it? Volodya had never heard a word of it from his mamma or any of the people round about him. Then the footman came to wake him for the morning train. He pretended to be asleep. "Bother it! Damn it all!" he thought. He got up between 10 and 11, combing his hair before the looking-glass and looking at his ugly face, pale from his sleepless night. He thought: "It's perfectly true, an ugly duckling." When mamma saw him and was horrified that he was not at his examination, Volodya said: "I overslept myself, maman. But don't worry, I will get a medical certificate." Madame Shumihin and Nyuta waked up at 1 o'clock. Volodya heard Madame Shumihin open her window with a bang, heard Nyuta go off into a peal of laughter in reply to her coarse voice. He saw the door open and a string of nieces and other toadies, among the latter was his mamma, file into lunch, caught a glimpse of Nyuta's freshly washed, laughing face, and beside her the black brows and beard of her husband, the architect, who had just arrived. Nyuta was wearing a little Russian dress, which did not suit her at all and made her look clumsy. The architect was making dull and vulgar jokes. The rissoles served at lunch had too much onion in them, so it seemed to Volodya. It also seemed to him that Nyuta laughed loudly on purpose and kept glancing in his direction, to give him to understand that the memory of the night did not trouble her in the least, and that she was not aware of the presence at table of the ugly duckling. At 4 o'clock Volodya drove to the station with his mamma. Foul memories, the sleepless night, the prospect of expulsion from school, the stings of conscience, all roused in him now an oppressive, gloomy anger. He looked at maman's short profile, at her little nose, at the raincoat which was a present from Nyuta, and muttered: "Why do you powder? It's not becoming at your age. You make yourself up. Don't pay your debts at cards. Smoke other people's tobacco. It's hateful. I don't love you. I don't love you." He was insulting her, and she moved her little eyes about in alarm, flung up her hands, and whispered in horror: "What are you saying, my dear? Good gracious! The coachman will hear. Be quiet, or the coachman will hear. He can overhear everything." "I don't love you. I don't love you," he went on breathlessly. "You've no soul and no morals. Don't dare to wear that raincoat, you hear, or else I will tear it to rags." "Control yourself, my child." Maman went. "The coachman can hear." "And where is my father's fortune? Where is your money? You have wasted it all. And I am not ashamed of being poor, but I am ashamed of having such a mother. When my schoolfellows ask questions about you, I always blush." In the train they had to pass 2 stations before they reached the town. Volodya spent all the time on the little platform between 2 carriages and shivered all over. He did not want to go into the compartment, because there the mother he hated was sitting. He hated himself, hated the ticket collectors, the smoke from the engine, the cold to which he attributed his shivering. And the heavier the weight on his heart, the more strongly he felt that somewhere in the world, among some people, there was a pure, honourable, warm, refined life, full of love, affection, gaiety, and serenity. He felt this, and was so intensely miserable that one of the passengers, after looking at his face attentively, actually asked: "You have the toothache, I suppose?" In the town maman and Volodya lived with Marya Petrovna, a lady of noble rank, who had a large flat and let rooms to boarders. Maman had 2 rooms, one with windows and 2 pictures in gold frames hanging on the walls, in which her bed stood and in which she lived, and a little room opening out of it in which Volodya lived. Here there was a sofa on which he slept, and, except that sofa, there was no other furniture. The rest of the room was entirely filled up with wicker baskets full of clothes, cardboard hat boxes, and all sorts of rubbish which maman preserved for some reason or other. Volodya prepared his lessons either in his mother's room or in the general room, as the large room in which the boarders assembled at dinner time and in the evening was called. On reaching home he lay down on his sofa and put the quilt over him to stop his shivering. The cardboard hat boxes, the wicker baskets, and the other rubbish reminded him that he had not a room of his own, and that he had no refuge in which he could get away from his mother, from her visitors, and from the voices that were floating up from the general room. The satchel and the books lying about in the corners reminded him of the examination he had missed. For some reason there came into his mind, quite inappropriately, Menton, where he had lived with his father when he was 7 years old. He thought of Biarritz and 2 little English girls with whom he ran about on the sand. He tried to recall to his memory the colour of the sky, the sea, the height of the waves, and his mood at the time, but he could not succeed. The English girls flitted before his imagination, as though they were living. All the rest was a medley of images that floated away in confusion.
"No, it's cold here," thought Volodya.
He got up, put on his overcoat, and went into the general room. There they were drinking tea. There were 3 people at the samovar: maman, an old lady with tortoiseshell pince nez, who gave music lessons, and Avgustin Mihalitch, an elderly and very stout Frenchman, who was employed at a perfumery factory. "I have had no dinner to day," said maman. "I ought to send the maid to buy some bread." "Dunyasha!" shouted the Frenchman. It appeared that the maid had been sent out somewhere by the lady of the house.
That is of no consequence," said the Frenchman with a broad smile. "I will go for some bread myself at once. Oh, it is nothing."
He laid his strong, pungent cigar in a conspicuous place, put on his hat, and went out. After he had gone away, maman began telling the music teacher how she had been staying at the Shumihins, and how warmly they welcomed her. "Lili Shumihin is a relative of mine, you know," she said. "Her late husband, General Shumihin, was a cousin of my husband, and she was a Baroness Kolb by birth."
"Maman, that's false," said Volodya irritably. "Why tell lies?"
He knew perfectly well that what his mother said was true. In what she was saying about General Shumihin and about Baroness Kolb there was not a word of lying, but nevertheless he felt she was lying. There was a suggestion of falsehood in her manner of speaking, in the expression of her face, in her eyes, in everything.
"You're lying,"
repeated Volodya, and he brought his fist down on the table with such force that all the crockery shook, and maman's tea was spilt over.
"Why do you talk about generals and baronesses? It's all lies."
The music teacher was disconcerted and coughed into her handkerchief, affecting to sneeze, and maman began to cry.
"Where can I go?" thought Volodya.
He had been in the street already. He was ashamed to go to his schoolfellows. Again, quite incongruously, he remembered the 2 little English girls. He paced up and down the general room and went into Avgustin Mihalitch's room. Here there was a strong smell of ethereal oils and glycerin soap. On the table, in the window, and even on the chairs there were a number of bottles, glasses, and wine glasses containing fluids of various colours. Volodya took up from the table a newspaper, opened it, and read the title "Figaro." There was a strong and pleasant scent about the paper. Then he took a revolver from the table. There, don't take any notice of it." The music teacher was comforting maman in the next room. "He is young. Young people of his age never restrain themselves. One must resign oneself to that."
"No, Yevgenia Andreevna, he's too spoilt,"
said maman in a sing-song voice. "He has no one in authority over him, and I am weak and can do nothing. Oh, I am unhappy." Volodya put the muzzle of the revolver to his mouth, felt something like a trigger or spring, and pressed it with his finger; then felt something else projecting, and once more pressed it. Taking the muzzle out of his mouth, he wiped it with the lapel of his coat, looked at the lock. He had never in his life taken a weapon in his hand before.
"I believe one ought to raise this,"
he reflected. "Yes, it seems so." Avgustin Mihalitch went into the general room, and with a laugh began telling them about something. Volodya put the muzzle in his mouth again, pressed it with his teeth, and pressed something with his fingers. There was the sound of a shot. Something hit Volodya in the back of his head with terrible violence, and he fell on the table with his face downwards among the bottles and glasses. Then he saw his father, as in Menton, in a top hat with a wide black band on it, wearing mourning for some lady, suddenly seize him by both hands, and they fell headlong into a very deep, dark pit. Then everything was blurred and vanished. End of chapter 6.
Of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. Chapter 7. The Husband. In the course of the maneuvers, the N Cavalry Regiment halted for a night at the district town of K. Such an event as the visit of officers always has the most exciting and inspiring effect on the inhabitants of provincial towns. The shopkeepers dream of getting rid of rusty sausages and best brand sardines that have been lying for 10 years on their shelves. The inns and restaurants keep open all night. The military commandant, his secretary, and the local garrison put on their best uniforms. The police flit to and fro like mad, while the effect on the ladies is beyond all description. The ladies of K, hearing the regiment approaching, forsook their pans of boiling jam and ran into the street. Forgetting their morning decibel and general untidiness, they rushed breathless with excitement to meet the regiment, and listened greedily to the band playing the march. Looking at their pale, ecstatic faces, one might have thought those strains came from some heavenly choir, rather than from a military brass band. "The regiment!" they cried joyfully. "The regiment is coming!" What could this unknown regiment that came by chance today and would depart at dawn tomorrow mean to them? Afterwards, when the officers were standing in the middle of the square, and with their hands behind them discussing the question of billets, all the ladies were gathered together at the examining magistrates, and vying with one another in their criticisms of the regiment. They already knew, goodness knows how, that the colonel was married but not living with his wife, that the senior officer's wife had a baby born dead every year, that the adjutant was hopelessly in love with some countess, and had even once attempted suicide. They knew everything. When a pockmarked soldier in a red shirt darted past the windows, they knew for certain that it was Lieutenant Rymzov's orderly running about the town trying to get some English bitter ale on tick for his master. They had only caught a passing glimpse of the officers' backs, but had already decided that there was not one handsome or interesting man among them. Having talked to their heart's content, they sent for the military commandant and the committee of the club, and instructed them at all costs to make arrangements for a dance. Their wishes were carried out. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the military band was playing in the street before the club, while in the club itself the officers were dancing with the ladies of K. The ladies felt as though they were on wings. Intoxicated by the dancing, the music, and the clank of spurs, they threw themselves heart and soul into making the acquaintance of their new partners, and quite forgot their old civilian friends. Their fathers and husbands, forced temporarily into the background, crowded around the meager refreshment table in the entrance hall. All these government cashiers, secretaries, clerks, and superintendents, stale, sickly-looking, clumsy figures, were perfectly well aware of their inferiority. They did not even enter the ballroom, but contented themselves with watching their wives and daughters in the distance dancing with the accomplished and graceful officers. Among the husbands was Shalikov the tax collector, a narrow, spiteful soul given to drink, with a big, closely cropped head and thick, protruding lips. He had a university education. There had been a time when he used to read progressive literature and sing student songs. But now, as he said of himself, he was a tax collector, and nothing more. He stood leaning against the doorpost, his eyes fixed on his wife, Anna Pavlovna, a little brunette of 30 with a long nose and a pointed chin. Tightly laced, with her face carefully powdered, she danced without pausing for breath, danced till she was ready to drop exhausted. But though she was exhausted in body, her spirit was inexhaustible. One could see as she danced that her thoughts were with the past, that faraway past when she used to dance at the college for young ladies, dreaming of a life of luxury and gaiety, and never doubting that her husband was to be a prince, or at the worst a baron. The tax collector watched, scowling with spite. It was not jealousy he was feeling. He was ill-humored. First, because the room was taken up with dancing, and there was nowhere he could play a game of cards. Secondly, because he could not endure the sound of wind instruments. And thirdly, because he fancied the officers treated the civilians somewhat too casually and disdainfully. But what above everything revolted him and moved him to indignation was the expression of happiness on his wife's face. "It makes me sick to look at her," he muttered, "going on for 40, and nothing to boast of at any time, and she must powder her face and lace herself up, and frizzing her hair, flirting and making faces, and fancying she's doing the thing in style. Oh, you're a pretty figure, upon my soul." Anna Pavlovna was so lost in the dance that she did not once glance at her husband. "Of course not. Where do we poor country bumpkins come in?" sneered the tax collector. "We are at a discount now. We're clumsy seals, unpolished provincial bears, and she's the queen of the ball. She's kept enough of her looks to please even officers. They'd not object to making love to her, I dare say." During the mazurka, the tax collector's face twitched with spite. A black-haired officer with prominent eyes and Tartar cheekbones danced the mazurka with Anna Pavlovna. Assuming a stern expression, he worked his legs with gravity and feeling, and so crooked his knees that he looked like a jack-a-dandy pulled by strings, while Anna Pavlovna, pale and thrilled, bending her figure languidly and turning her eyes up, tried to look as though she scarcely touched the floor, and evidently felt herself that she was not on earth, not at the local club, but somewhere far, far away, in the clouds. Not only her face, but her whole figure was expressive of beatitude. The tax collector could endure it no longer. He felt a desire to jeer at that beatitude, to make Anna Pavlovna feel that she had forgotten herself, that life was by no means so delightful as she fancied now in her excitement. "You wait. I'll teach you to smile so blissfully," he muttered. "You are not a boarding school miss. You are not a girl. An old fright ought to realize she is a fright." Petty feelings of envy, vexation, wounded vanity, of that small provincial misanthropy engendered in petty officials by vodka and a sedentary life, swarmed in his heart like mice. Waiting for the end of the mazurka, he went into the hall and walked up to his wife. Anna Pavlovna was sitting with her partner, and flirting her fan and coquettishly dropping her eyelids, was describing how she used to dance in Petersburg. Her lips were pursed up like a rosebud, and she pronounced, "At home in Petersburg." "Anyuta, let us go home," croaked the tax collector. Seeing her husband standing before her, Anna Pavlovna started, as though recalling the fact that she had a husband. Then she flushed all over. She felt ashamed that she had such a sickly-looking, ill-humored, ordinary husband. "Let us go home," repeated the tax collector. "Why? It's quite early." "I beg you to come home," said the tax collector deliberately, with a spiteful expression. "Why? Has anything happened?" Anna Pavlovna asked in a flutter. "Nothing has happened, but I wish you to go home at once. I wish it, that's enough. And without further talk, please." Anna Pavlovna was not afraid of her husband, but she felt ashamed on account of her partner, who was looking at her husband with surprise and amusement. She got up and moved a little apart with her husband. "What notion is this?" she began. "Why go home? Why, it's not 11 o'clock. "I wish it, and that's enough. Come along, and that's all about it." "Don't be silly. Go home alone if you want to." "All right, then I shall make a scene." The tax collector saw the look of beatitude gradually vanish from his wife's face, saw how ashamed and miserable she was, and he felt a little happier. "Why do you want me at once?" asked his wife. "I don't want you, but I wish you to be at home. I wish it, that's all." At first Anna Pavlovna refused to hear of it. Then she began entreating her husband to let her stay just another half hour. Then, without knowing why, she began to apologize, to protest, and all in a whisper, with a smile, that the spectators might not suspect that she was having a tiff with her husband. She began assuring him she would not stay long, only another 10 minutes, only 5 minutes. But the tax collector stuck obstinately to his point. "Stay if you like," he said, "but I'll make a scene if you do." And as she talked to her husband, Anna Pavlovna looked thinner, older, plainer. Pale, biting her lips, and almost crying, she went out to the entry and began putting on her things. "You're not going?" asked the ladies in surprise. "Anna Pavlovna, you're not going, dear?" "Her head aches," said the tax collector for his wife. Coming out of the club, the husband and the wife walked all the way home in silence. The tax collector walked behind his wife, and watching her downcast, sorrowful, humiliated little figure, he recalled the look of beatitude which had so irritated him at the club, and the consciousness that the beatitude was gone filled his soul with triumph. He was pleased and satisfied, and at the same time he felt a lack of something. He would have liked to go back to the club and make everyone feel dreary and miserable, so that all might know how stale and worthless life is when you walk along the streets in the dark and hear the slush of the mud under your feet, and when you know that you will wake up the next morning with nothing to look forward to but vodka and cards. Oh, how awful it is! And Anna Pavlovna could scarcely walk. She was still under the influence of the dancing, the music, the talk, the lights, and the noise. She asked herself as she walked along why God had thus afflicted her. She felt miserable, insulted, and choking with hate as she listened to her husband's heavy footsteps. She was silent, trying to think of the most offensive, biting, and venomous words she could hurl at her husband, and at the same time she was fully aware that no word could penetrate her tax collector's hide. What did he care for words? Her bitterest enemy could not have contrived for her a more helpless position. And meanwhile the band was playing, and the darkness was full of the most rousing, intoxicating dance tunes. End of Chapter 7. End of The Lady with the Dog and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett.